this is Aaron Dominion, and welcome to the Creation Kit scripting series Papyrus tutorials. In this episode, it's variables, the fourth part, and this is going to be the final part, and we're going to go over variable scope in some detail. So what will be covered today, how persistent a variable is, variables as a function or event, parameter / argument, whichever way you've heard it, or we'll hear it in the future because we haven't covered functions in this tutorial series, but we need to cover it for the topic of variable scope and see what their persistence and how you can change it is. That's what mutability means here in this case. And then we're going to introduce properties because they're tied to variable scope, and global variables, that's also tied to variable scope. So let's go into regular variable persistence real quick. So scope of a regular variable, it's just a variable that is not a property and it's limited to the event or the function where it's declared. For example, I give two examples here, one with an event and one with a function, and if you call that variable outside of the event, it's going to cause the compiler for Papyrus and the Creation Kit just to freak out and say, this doesn't exist. There is no avar, or whatever the message is going to be. We'll find out in the actual live coding portion of this. So these are variables that are not globals or properties typically, and limited to the script they're in. So if you declared it outside of a function, yes, it will still be there, and you could still use it internally, but you can't use it outside of there ever. At least that's what I've heard. We'll find out if that's the case in the actual live coding section, so take this slide with a grain of salt. So this is the most important part of when to use a regular variable. It's a temporary value holder in most cases. You also use it to perform calculations before assigning it to a more persistent variable, or you use it to pass into a function. Alright, to go hand in hand, let's look at variables as function and event arguments. So I'm going to briefly introduce function and event arguments before we go into it into more detail when we cover functions and events. But a function argument is a variable that is required for the function. For example, if you look in the actor script page of the Creation Kit wiki, you'll see the function damage actor value, and it has two parameters or two arguments. The first parameter or argument is the value's name, which they call as value name, and that requires it to be a string in the first spot. And then you have the float AF damage for the second argument or second parameter, and basically it's the damage you want to do to the actor value. For example, you put the string health and you do 50, you damage their health by 50. Let's look at another example, just because the first example is a function. This is an event right here. So whenever a NPC dies, it calls the onDeath event, and information that's passed to that event is the NPC that killed the NPC. So if the player kills a bandit, the player will be AK killer, since it's an actor object that requires. Okay, argument scope. So function and event arguments only exist for the duration of the event or function call. So going back to the bandit example for the event onDeath, player only useful for as long as onDeath is active. After onDeath runs its course, goes through all of lines, AK killer is not stored, so player is not in that event call, and the script won't know what player is outside of that event anymore. Another example, let's have a set unconscious function. It's not a real function, but let's pretend for a moment it is. And then we have the Boolean is conscious that's passed into it. And is conscious will only be a variable while A, that function gets called with that value, and then B, within the function until the function reaches the end function block. So you have to either set it to a variable that's persistent, properties, which we'll go into in a moment, and you can set it to a global if it's a numeric value, but we'll get into that in a moment as well. So changing argument values, again, I was speaking about this a little early, my bad. So you can only make changes to the value if you're using the same value within the function or event, unless if you assign it to a property or a variable that retains its value outside of the function or event. Remember these limitations when you are messing around with functions and events, and have to decide what you use. Okay, so here's something really important: properties, because you will be using a lot of properties in your scripts. So what is a property? A property is a persistent variable that can be used in any function or event within a script file, and the game stores that in memory while the script is active. The property can be given to other scripts or written to the script, or the value can be changed by other scripts. Sorry for the weird wording there. Via special functions that you have to create. We'll get into that in a moment. So the scope of a property, it can be used in any function or event, and any values assigned to a property in a function or event will remain within the script even after your function or event call expires. So if we called the onDeath and stored player into a player property, player would then be a permanent part of the script. Same thing for isConscious. If we wrote it to a player isConscious variable or something like that, or property, excuse me, that will be persistent. So how do you access or a property outside of a script by another script? So you have to write special functions. To write to a property, you have to have a setter function. So in an example here, we have an int property called myInt, and we have a function here, setMyInt, and then it's passed in an argument called value. And basically, this function, all it does is have myInt, and it assigns it value. And to get the function out, or to get the property outside of the function, you have a myInt here, and it's a return type of int. We'll go into function return types whenever we get to the function portion, and you just return myInt. Here's some special things to note. These aren't important, but this will help. Just think about, okay, what type of property is this? Is this just a public property that, oh hey, the script can know, but nobody else can bombard it and change it or get that information out? So a write function that we have, like setMyInt, if you only have that function and not the getMyInt, you make that property write only, which means, oh hey, I can change the value, but I can't see that value ever. And then if you have only the get function instead of the set one, it makes that a read-only property. And basically that means, oh hey, I can see what the value is, but I can never change that value. Which that might be more useful than changing the value in some cases. Some cases you want it the other way around. Some cases you want it to be both read and write. It just depends on what your script's doing there. So when do you use a property? Anytime that you need value persistence and a normal variable does not cut it. And to communicate information between scripts, any type of information, since a property can be any object or primary variable type. Be careful though, because the more properties that you have for a script, the more your script takes up in memory. Keep that in mind. Global variables. These are also good for variable scope. So what is a global variable? It is a numerical value that the game keeps track of. There's three primary types for a global: a short, a long, and a float. Short and long in the game mean the same thing though, so I'm not sure why the creation kit makes that distinction. Basically, short and longs are integer types. Short being typically an 8-bit, 16-bit integer, at least in the programming definition, and a long being a full 32-bit integer. And then a float acts like the normal float that we've talked about in the past. Unfortunately, it looks like the game stores every single global as a 32-bit float, so keep that in mind whenever you have 32-bit integers. It might store it weirdly. So the game keeps track of it no matter what, but if you set your value to constant, it will not be part of the saved game whenever you save your game. If you don't have it as a constant, your saved game will keep track of the global variable too, which is a cool thing to do. So what's a global scope? They have global scope. That's really weird to say, but that means basically anything in the game can look at a global variable and use it if it needs to. Typically it's going to be scripts or conditions like package conditions, dialog conditions, quest conditions, message box conditions if you have any, that will be using global variables if you needed a value check over something that you've done in a script or something. When do you use globals? Typically you want to use it if you have multiple systems that need to keep track of a particular value or change in value. Scripts typically, or conditionals. Because it takes up space and memory and it will bloat your saved game after a while. If you have too many globals in use, try to minimize the use of globals. And also, it's probably a good idea if you have only one script but lots of conditionals. Yes, you want to use a global, but if you have multiple scripts and no conditionals that you're using, think about using the property getSet method instead of using a global. Alright, so let's put this all together real quick. So let's go back to our variable cell and our barrel that we've been using for variables. Poor barrel. And we have a variable scoped script. So we have to know how to create properties. So, oh, that adds script. My bad. Let's go to the properties button instead. Also, because globals, we have to find globals here. So, is it under world data? No, it's under miscellaneous. Here we go. So, again, this doesn't matter too much. Let's keep it as a short though. What do we want to call this? Variable scope global, and we'll have its initial value to 0. So let's add two properties. So variable scope int property, and we want a global. For the purposes of it autofilling, I am going to do the method where you have the acronym and then caps. Okay, and then we edit this guy's value just to be 0. Yep. So if we go back to Notepad++, alright, there we go, that's the message I was looking for. And you'll see our properties here. So, get into the habit of doing this, commenting for each of your properties. So, this is our integer property for the property scope test, and this is our global property for the global scope test. Although we won't see that too often. This guy we're not really going to be able to test too much, but I'm going to go over basically how to set and get values from a global in here. So let's have our trusty event on init, just so this happens at the very beginning. And let's try this. Our regular variable test. So let's say int var not prop. Declare that there. Let's do our and let's make a function myfunct Alright, so first test, let's initialize our var not prop to equal 0, and as our first test, actually let's finish up this simple function real quick. Finish function. Let's also create the property functions. Get var scope int prop function, and then we're going to have it return our variable scope int prop. Input, we have no input into this function, and then this function retrieves the value of variable scope int prop for use outside of this script. Okay. I'm going to copy the comment. I know this is not good style, but just to save on time. So instead of retrieving the value, this is going to set the value, and this is going to be function set var scope int prop, and it's going to be passed a value. And what we're going to do is take variable scope int prop and have it equal to the value there. Okay. So our first test, oh, let's finish up this function. So value equals value equals 1, var not prop equals 2. We're going to call my funct with value 0. And let's call this with value. Let's first do this, just so we do this. And let's do a debug.message box and value. Let's see what Creation Kit says on this. Value is not defined, so my function's value will not be used. So let's do this instead and see if this saves. Notice this works both at the top level and in here in our event and in our function, my funct. Now let's try to do this real quick, just to see if we can get it to crash itself again. We're not going to do a test in game because this is something you really can't show in game this time around. So input none, because this is another return function. This function retrieves the value of var not prop, maybe. So int function get var not prop and function, and then we want it to return var not prop. So let's go back to this, edit the source. First, do this test. Okay, that test worked. Let's go over here and do get var not prop. And that's saved. Okay. So you can have regular variables internally that you can use to pass values between functions, and you can hypothetically use it on other scripts. I don't recommend this. It's not really a good practice. The variables that you declare that aren't properties are meant to be private to the function, and it's bad practice. I'm just giving you that warning before you go off and do it. Yeah, there's not really much more that you can do, but this gives you an idea, a good idea of what you need to do here. Oh yeah, let's do globals real quick. So we have our global variable scope global dot set value to 1, then our global is and get value. Okay. Let's see if that compiles. And that compiles. That's this function here. Set values, how you change a global variable, and then if you have to get a global variable, do this. There's something I need to show you, because you will want to use globals for floats or ints. So int global as int, and it's going to equal scope global dot get value, excuse me, and then float global as float is going to equal scope global dot get value. Now let's see what the compiler does here. Oh no. Oh. That is not the error I was looking for. I forgot to put the full acronym there. Alright. Close this up. Go back to the source. Let's save it again. That's the error I was looking for. So type mismatch while assigning to an int, because they are missing or unrelated types. Basically, because of how it stores internally. Let's look where line 22 is. It's where we're assigning the global to an int. It's a float, so we have to do a type conversion to an integer. Let's save that, close out of that, at source, now let's save it again. And that saves. You don't have to do it in the second case because it stores your global variable as a float, which is good news if you're using floats, bad news if you're using ints. Although, as a word of caution, most of the time if you're using straight values like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on in a global, just for state checks, you don't want to use a float. But if you're storing percentages or something like that in a global, then you might want to use float. I'm not sure how it stores that entirely, but since it's technically stored as a float, you should have your percent come out. Alright, and I think that's it for variable scope. This concludes our variable portion of the scripting tutorials. We will be moving on to events and functions. I think first we will touch on events because that's how Skyrim processes everything. But if you have a question over any of the variable stuff or stuff that hasn't been covered here that concerns variables or just scripting questions in general, I have my form profile here and my Nexus profile here. I will also have them in the video description. Feel free to message me about any of those questions or concerns. And I hope to see you on the next episode.